The day I found out I'd bought a house in a secret zone controlled by a manipulative HOA was the day I realized I had bought far more than a house. I had bought a weapon. Have you ever bought a house thinking you were making the right investment only to discover that your dream home was built on a powder keg? What if that home was in a neighborhood where nothing is as it seems, and every turn you take reveals a new layer of corruption, secrecy, and power plays that you never even knew existed? Well, I didn't just find out that my new home was a mess. I found out it was a trap set by a homeowners association that had been operating in the shadows using underhanded tactics to control an entire area, and I was their latest target. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't the type to just take a punch and keep moving. No, this was where I drew the line. My name is Jack Matthews. I'm an investor, not a real estate mogul, but someone who knew how to buy properties. That would give me both peace of mind and financial security. I wasn't looking for drama when I bought this particular home, tucked away in a quiet, upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. To me, it was the perfect place to unwind. After a long day of meetings and phone calls, the property had a lush, sprawling lawn, an old-fashioned charm, and most importantly, it was in a neighborhood that seemed to have all the right markers of a safe, well-maintained place to live. But it didn't take long for the unsettling whispers to begin. It was my second week in the house when I first heard about the secret zone. It was a passing comment from a neighbor, an older man with a slow southern drawl who lived a few houses down. We were chatting one evening, and his words caught me off guard. "You new folks around here know about the secret zone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he glanced around to make sure no one else was listening. I chuckled. Secret zone? Sounds like something out of a spy movie. What do you mean? He leaned in a little closer, his voice lowering even further. The HOA. They've got a corner of the neighborhood they've been controlling for years. They use it for all kinds of shady stuff. People can't sell or even renovate their homes without getting their approval. And heaven forbid you mess with any of their rules. I thought it was a joke at first, some kind of wild conspiracy theory passed down through gossip. But as I continued to live in the neighborhood, I started noticing things. Little things. Peculiarities that didn't add up. The strange fines for minor offenses, the way the HOA seemed to have far too much influence over local laws, and the way people moved in and out of the neighborhood so quickly, almost like they were being pushed out. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I decided to dig deeper. What I found was far more disturbing than I could have ever imagined. The first thing I did was pull up property records. It didn't take long before I found that the area where I had bought my house was, in fact, within this so-called secret zone. But it wasn't just a small area. It was a strategically placed piece of land where the HOA had complete control over real estate transactions. They had manipulated zoning laws, purchased property in bulk through shell companies, and made sure that any new development or renovation required their permission. If you wanted to do anything, you had to go through them. As I researched further, it became clear that the HOA had been using these secret zones to inflate property values artificially, controlling who could buy and sell property in these areas. While making a tidy profit off it, they would deny or approve applications based on whatever suited their interests at the time. Buyers like me, who weren't aware of the HOA's full influence, were often stuck with absurd rules that made life difficult and expensive. But the worst part? They were practically unchallenged. The city had long turned a blind eye to the HOA's shady dealings, and homeowners who tried to challenge them often found themselves facing legal battles they couldn't afford. People were forced to comply with regulations that felt like they were plucked out of thin air, rules that seemed arbitrary but were carefully designed to keep people in check. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept turning over the discovery. This HOA wasn't just some minor annoyance. It was a system designed to trap homeowners in a cycle of dependency and control. They didn't just want to own property. They wanted to own people. I wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. In fact, I was the type of person who looked for opportunities in problems. This wasn't an obstacle. This was my next move. Started planning. I'd always been good at understanding systems, how they worked, where the cracks were, and most importantly, how to exploit them. The HOA had underestimated me. They had no idea that the innocent man who had just moved in was actually an investor with deep pockets and a sharp mind for strategy. This wasn't about fighting petty neighborhood rules. This was about dismantling an entire system of corruption and taking back control of the neighborhood. I set up a meeting with a real estate attorney I had worked with on other projects. He was sharp, and his understanding of property laws and HOAs was second to none. We spent hours going over zoning laws, researching the HOA's financials, and analyzing the loopholes in their system. The more we uncovered, the more convinced I became that the HOA was operating outside the bounds of legality. They had been making illegal property deals, forcing homeowners into agreements that had no legal foundation. It was ripe for a takedown, but this wouldn't be some dramatic courtroom battle. No, I was going to use their own tactics against them. If they thought they controlled the neighborhood, they were about to learn a hard lesson in who truly owned it. The next morning, I met with my attorney again, this time with a clearer plan. I had decided that I wasn't just going to buy more property around the neighborhood. I was going to buy all of it. I knew exactly where to look. I knew the families who were struggling to sell, the people who had already been forced out. I knew where the HOA had been manipulating real estate, prices, buying up vacant lots to control future developments. And now, I was going to use that knowledge to start buying up the land in a methodical way. In the weeks that followed, I started purchasing homes around the secret zone. Every time I bought a new house, the HOA took notice. They started sending me letters, trying to intimidate me into stopping. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Every property I bought increased my leverage, and soon, I owned nearly half of the homes in the area. By now, the HOA had no choice but to take me seriously. They realized that I wasn't just some naive newcomer. I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. I was rewriting the game, and that's when I decided to make my move. One evening, I walked into the HOA office, where they were having a meeting to discuss neighborhood regulations. The room went silent when I entered. The people sitting at the table, board members, property managers, and even a few city officials, looked up, confused. They didn't recognize me at first, but I didn't need them to. I had been watching them long enough to know what they were up to. "I'd like to speak," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I think it's time we had a discussion about the future of this neighborhood." Their eyes narrowed. The board members glanced at each other, unsure of how to react. They had always been the ones in control. Now, they were facing someone who had the power to take it all away. "I've been doing some research," I continued, "and I think it's clear that the HOA's control over this neighborhood has crossed a line. You've been manipulating property values, imposing arbitrary rules, and forcing homeowners into a system they can't escape. And I'm here to tell you that I've had enough." The room was tense. I could see the board members shifting uncomfortably. They were used to intimidating others, not being intimidated themselves. "I own half of the properties here now," I said, "and I'm in the process of acquiring more. I think it's time we reevaluate who really runs this neighborhood." The silence stretched out before someone finally broke it. "You can't just," one of them began, but I cut them off. "You don't own this place anymore," I said. "I do. And now, the rules are changing." I could feel the weight of their stares on me as I left the HOA office. The board members had gone silent, perhaps not fully grasping the magnitude of what I had just revealed. I could tell they were unsure of their next move. One thing was certain: they were no longer in control. For the first time, the balance of power had shifted. The very next day, I started receiving calls from the HOA, each one more desperate than the last. At first, it was just a few warnings. Then they began to threaten legal action. I didn't mind. I knew exactly how to play this game. The fact that I had gotten under their skin so quickly was already a sign that I had found the right approach. But I wasn't playing a short game. I was thinking long-term, and every move I made now needed to be calculated, deliberate, and precise. If I played my cards right, I wouldn't just expose the HOA for the corrupt organization it had become. I'd dismantle it entirely. I could already see how this would play out in my mind. It was only a matter of time before they would have no choice but to capitulate, but I wasn't going to give them the easy way out. They had to understand the extent of their mistakes. I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to win. I'd spent years honing my skills in business and real estate. Buying properties had become second nature to me, and I knew how to assess value where others saw none. I had seen patterns, recognized strategies, and understood how people and organizations worked. The HOA's control over the area wasn't as ironclad as they thought. It was brittle, built on a foundation of manipulation and intimidation. As I continued to buy more properties, the HOA's responses became more erratic. They sent me letters threatening lawsuits, accusing me of manipulating property values. Their lawyers called, demanding I stop purchasing more homes. I knew their tactic, try to scare me into submission, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. They had no idea that each letter they sent me was just one more piece in my grand plan. With each new property I acquired, I gained more leverage. My goal was simple. I would control the area, and I would ensure that the residents, not the HOA, had the power. But this wasn't just about owning land, it was about exposing a broken system, showing how the HOA was exploiting the community and giving it back to the people. I started talking to the neighbors more. At first, I kept my distance, unsure of who could be trusted. But the more I learned about the homeowners, the more I realized that many of them were just like me, caught in a web they didn't know how to escape. Some had been paying fines. For years, others had been forced to make renovations that were unnecessary, all to appease the HOA. A few had already tried to fight back, only to be drowned out by the HOA's power. These people didn't just need someone to help them, they needed someone to lead. One afternoon, I had a conversation with Carol, a middle-aged woman who lived a few doors down from me. She was one of the few residents who had been vocal about the HOA's unfair practices. She had tried to organize a petition to demand transparency from the HOA, but her efforts had been quickly shut down. "The thing is," Carol said, her voice low, "the HOA controls everything here. They make the rules. They decide who can sell their homes, and they've got the city in their pocket. Every time I try to take a stand, I get fined or threatened. It's like there's no way out." I listened to her, and I understood. It wasn't just about property rights anymore. It was about control, about the right to live without fear of being dictated to by an outside force. The HOA had done what they did because they could. They knew that if enough people were too afraid to speak out, they could keep their grip on power indefinitely. But what if the people weren't afraid anymore? What if I could rally the community to take a stand? "I've got a plan," I said, my voice steady with confidence. "And it starts with the HOA thinking they still have control. But I'm going to turn the tables on them. I'm going to show them what happens when you mess with the wrong person." Carol looked skeptical at first, but then a spark of hope flickered in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I'm buying up the rest of the neighborhood," I told her. "I'm going to own it. The HOA won't be able to stop me, and once I've got control of the land, we'll be able to change the rules. It's time for the people here to take back what's theirs." She didn't need to be convinced. Carol knew what I was saying was true. We had both seen the power the HOA had over the neighborhood, and we both knew that if we could turn that power into something positive, something for the community, we could not only fight back, we could win. Over the next few weeks, I continued my quiet purchasing spree. I kept my transactions low profile, using shell companies and legal loopholes to avoid drawing too much attention. The more I bought, the more I realized how deep the HOA's influence really went. They had manipulated zoning laws, purchased properties under anonymous names, and used their power to control everything from landscaping to building permits. They had created a labyrinth of rules designed to keep residents in check while quietly profiting off their manipulation. But with each new acquisition, I felt the walls closing in on the HOA. They didn't realize it yet, but they were running out of time. The more properties I bought, the more leverage I had. It was no longer just about owning land. It was about exposing the truth, about showing the residents how they had been manipulated. It was time to start executing the second phase of my plan. I knew that simply owning the properties wouldn't be enough. The HOA would fight back, of course, but they wouldn't be able to stop me once I started pulling the strings. It was time to make my move. I contacted a few of the homeowners who had been vocal about the HOA's unfair practices and began organizing meetings. Slowly, the idea started to spread. People began to talk. The more I revealed about the HOA's underhanded tactics, the more I realized just how many people were willing to fight back. There was a real growing momentum now. One evening, after another successful acquisition, I stood at my window looking out at the neighborhood. In my mind, I was already strategizing the next step. I could see how this was all going to unfold. It would start small, with an email campaign, maybe a few flyers posted around the neighborhood. But soon, it would grow into something bigger. The HOA had no idea what was coming. Then came the breakthrough. A former employee of the HOA who had grown disillusioned with the organization's practices reached out to me. She had worked for the HOA for over 10 years and had witnessed firsthand how the board members had manipulated property values and forced residents into costly, unnecessary renovations. "I've got all the documents you need," she told me. "The contracts, the emails, the invoices, they're all there. Everything you need to take them down." I couldn't believe my luck. This was the smoking gun I had been waiting for. With this evidence, I could not only take control of the neighborhood, but I could expose the HOA's corrupt practices to the public. This wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about exposing the fraud, the manipulation, the lies. I knew the next step. I would use this evidence to take the HOA to court. I would fight them in the legal system and win. Once I had the community behind me, once I showed them the truth, the HOA would be powerless. But I also knew that the fight wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had deep pockets and would stop at nothing to protect its interests. But I had something they didn't. I had the truth on my side. The next few days were a blur of meetings, legal consultations, and strategic planning. I wasn't just preparing for a court case, I was preparing for a public showdown, one that would change the neighborhood forever. The sun was setting as I stood in front of the small, unassuming HOA office, the very building that had become the nerve center of a corrupt and manipulative system. I had been here before, but this time I wasn't just a curious new neighbor. This time, I was here with a purpose. And this time, I wasn't walking out empty-handed. The quiet months of planning, researching, and acquiring properties had come to fruition. The HOA didn't realize it yet, but their empire of control was crumbling. I'd bought up nearly all the properties in the secret zone. The community, once docile and subjugated, was slowly waking up, realizing that the puppet strings of the HOA no longer had a hold on them. And now, with the support of key residents and the evidence of the HOA's manipulation in hand, it was time to make my move. Inside the HOA office, a sense of unease lingered in the air. The board members were clearly rattled by the sudden flurry of activity in the neighborhood. The emails, the letters, the phone calls, they were all coming too fast for them to control. But the HOA had never faced an adversary like me before. They were accustomed to people being too afraid to fight back, to rolling over when faced with their legal threats and bully tactics. They hadn't anticipated someone like me, someone who knew how to play their game, but with a far smarter and more calculated hand. I walked into the meeting room, where the HOA board members sat, silently waiting for me. There was no outward show of hostility yet, just thinly veiled discomfort. They knew they were cornered, but they didn't know yet how badly they were about to lose. Mr. Matthews, one of the board members, a graying man named Harold, said with forced politeness. He was the HOA president, the mastermind behind most of the schemes that had kept this neighborhood under lock and key for years. "What brings you here today?" "I think it's time we had a little chat about how things are going around here," I said, my voice calm, unbothered. "You see, I've been doing a little research of my own, and I think it's safe to say I know a few things about your operations that could change everything. I wasn't here for pleasantries. I wasn't here to negotiate. I wasn't here to apologize for anything. I was here to take back what was rightfully mine and expose the HOA for what it was, a corrupt institution that had exploited its position to control the lives of its residents." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We're not sure what you mean, Mr. Matthews. If this is about the properties—" "Actually, Harold," I interrupted, my gaze firm, "this is about far more than the properties. This is about how you and your board have been running a tight little racket for years. Do you think the community doesn't notice? Do you think the people who live here don't see what's going on?" I could feel the tension building in the room. They were starting to realize that this wasn't going to be one of those conversations where they could just placate me with half-baked promises and vague reassurances. No, this time the truth was going to be heard loud and clear. "I know about the secret zone," I continued, leaning forward slightly. "I know how you've been using it to manipulate property values, restrict sales, and demand unnecessary fees from homeowners. And I know how you've been working with contractors and real estate agents to inflate prices for your own gain." I paused for a moment, watching their faces. The shock was evident on each one of them, even Harold, who prided himself on being untouchable. It was a small victory, but it was an important one. The element of surprise was mine, and it was a powerful weapon. "I've been acquiring property in this neighborhood for months now," I said, each word deliberate. "And I now own half of it. I have the leverage you didn't think I would ever get. And what's more, I have all the documents I need to expose every shady deal you've made, all the illegal zoning practices, all the inflated property sales, the manipulative contracts you've used to force homeowners to bend to your will." The room was silent now. Harold's eyes flickered briefly toward the other board members, but there was no more bravado in his posture. They had no idea what to say, how to react. And that was exactly how I wanted it. "I have everything I need to go public," I continued. "And when I do, this HOA will be dismantled. You will be exposed for the frauds you are. The entire neighborhood will know what you've been doing to them for years." Harold's voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. "You can't just destroy everything we've built. We've kept this neighborhood safe. We've maintained the property values. People trust us." "Trust?" I shot back. "People trusted you to maintain their homes, not to financially suffocate them. Trust isn't built on extortion and manipulation. Trust is built on respect. You've lost both." At that moment, the door to the meeting room swung open, and one of the other board members, a woman named Cynthia, stepped in. She looked more rattled than usual, a nervous twitch in her voice. "Mr. Matthews, I think you're making a mistake," she began, but I could see that she wasn't as confident as before. Her eyes darted toward Harold, waiting for him to intervene. "The HOA has worked for years to protect the value of the neighborhood. You can't just tear it all down. The community would be at risk. People will fight us." I didn't even flinch. "I'm not tearing anything down. I'm rebuilding it, from the ground up. A neighborhood based on transparency, fairness, and freedom. The HOA has manipulated this area for too long. It's time to bring the truth to light." There was no more arguing, no more trying to keep control of the situation. The air in the room was thick with realization. They had lost. But instead of backing down, I kept pressing forward. "I've already started the process of shifting control," I said. I've talked to the residents. I've informed them of what you've been doing. People are waking up. And once I've acquired the last few pieces of property, I'm going to dissolve this board. We'll elect new representatives, residents who understand what it means to protect the community, not profit off of it. Harold stood up abruptly, his face flushed. You can't just take over. We've been here for decades. We have the legal authority. I smiled, finally feeling a shift in my favor. Not for long, I said calmly. Your legal authority is based on lies and deception. You've been exploiting your power, and now it's time to pay for that. I've already spoken to an attorney, and we've got all the evidence we need to expose everything. For a moment, they didn't know what to do. I knew this was a pivotal moment, the point at which the HOA could either buckle under the pressure or make a desperate attempt to maintain control. But there was nothing they could do to stop me now. The truth was out, and the gears of justice were already in motion. As I stood up, preparing to leave, I turned one last time to face the board members. Their eyes were wide with disbelief, their faces pale. You've lost, I said simply. And the best part is I didn't even have to fight you directly. You fought yourselves. You exposed your own greed, your own corruption. And now the world will know what you've done. I left the room with my head held high, the weight of the fight lifting from my shoulders. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The HOA would try to fight back, no doubt. They'd drag out the legal battle, try to throw roadblocks in my way. But I was prepared. I had the evidence, the support, and the community on my side. They didn't stand a chance. Now it was time for the final chapter, the public showdown, and I was ready. The courtroom was a surreal scene of quiet tension. The walls, lined with law books, cast long shadows that seemed to loom over the gathering like silent witnesses. I walked in with my lawyer, Ruth, who had become one of the most valuable allies in this entire process. She was a no-nonsense attorney who specialized in property law, and she'd helped me uncover every single illegal action the HOA had taken over the years. She'd also made it clear to me that if this went to court, it wouldn't just be about winning, it would be about making sure the HOA never had a chance to manipulate anyone again. I took a seat at the plaintiff's table, the same place where I'd once sat with a sense of uncertainty and helplessness when I had first realized what I was up against. Now, I felt a quiet confidence. This was the culmination of everything I had fought for. I wasn't just taking back my neighborhood. I was taking down an empire of corruption built on the backs of people just trying to live their lives. The room filled slowly with spectators, mostly neighbors who had supported me in this battle. The other seats were occupied by legal teams, city officials, and a few representatives from the HOA itself. Harold, Cynthia, and the others were sitting at the defendant's table, their faces pale and anxious. They were used to holding all, the cards making all the rules, but now they were facing the consequences of their actions, and they knew there was no escape. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. I had expected some resistance. I knew that the HOA's legal team would try to discredit me, twist the facts, and stall the case. But they weren't prepared for what came next. Ruth stood up first, presenting the evidence with calm precision. The documents we had gathered, property records, emails, contracts, and internal memos, painted a damning picture. Ruth took the time to explain how the HOA had not only manipulated zoning laws to increase property values for their own financial gain, but how they had used their power to suppress homeowners, forcing them into costly renovations, issuing fines for arbitrary reasons, and threatening lawsuits to maintain control over every aspect of the neighborhood. The truth of it all hung in the air like a heavy fog. The audience could feel it. The board members of the HOA, once so sure of their invincibility, sat in their seats, visibly shrinking with every word Ruth spoke. Their defenses crumbled piece by piece. They had been exposed for what they were, a group of individuals who had used their authority to abuse the very people they were supposed to serve. But we weren't done yet. I stood up, addressing the court with the calm, unwavering voice that had served me so well throughout this journey. I bought my home because I wanted a place to call my own, I began, my words clear and deliberate. What I didn't know was that I was stepping into a web of manipulation, greed, and control. The HOA didn't just impose rules, they made a habit of breaking the law, of bending the system to suit their needs. They did this to countless homeowners, forcing people into debt, isolating them, and taking away their basic rights as property owners. I paused, looking directly at the board members seated across from me. Harold, Cynthia, and the others were staring at me, their faces a mix of anger and fear. I didn't come here to tear down your organization, I continued. I came here to give the community back its power, to show people that it's possible, to fight back. The HOA didn't just take control of property values, they took control of lives. And it's time for that to end. The room was silent. The tension was so thick that you could feel it pressing against your skin. The judge's eyes were fixed on me, and I knew that this was the moment when everything I had fought for would either fall apart or come to fruition. Ruth followed up, presenting more evidence, showing how the community had been complicit in their silence, how residents had been afraid to speak out, how they had been intimidated into compliance. But the message was clear now. We were not afraid anymore. The HOA's lawyers tried to push back. They tried to argue that what they had done was in the best interest of the community, that they had only acted to preserve property values. But their arguments were weak, flimsy, and full of holes. It was clear to everyone in the room that the HOA had been operating in bad faith. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, called for a brief recess. When the court reconvened, the judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The Homeowners Association is hereby ordered to cease all further operations in this neighborhood, the judge said, his voice firm. The practices of the HOA have been deemed illegal and harmful to the residents. Furthermore, the court will initiate a full investigation into the financial dealings of the HOA. The board members are to be held accountable for their actions. There it was, the ruling I had been waiting for. The victory was not just mine, it was the community's victory. It was a victory for every homeowner who had ever felt helpless, for every person who had been silenced by the weight of the HOA's power. The room erupted in a wave of murmurs and whispers, and I allowed myself a small smile. But this wasn't the time for celebration. There was still more to do. The court had given us the ruling, but now it was up to the community to rebuild, to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. As the court session ended, I stood up and made my way toward the door. The board members of the HOA sat motionless, their faces twisted in disbelief. They had thought they were untouchable, but today they had learned a hard lesson. No one is untouchable, not when the truth comes to light. I walked out of the courtroom, with Ruth by my side, my heart racing not from the adrenaline of victory, but from the realization of what was still to come. This wasn't just about a legal win. This was about making sure that the changes we had fought for would last, that the community would thrive, and that the HOA would never be able to hurt anyone again. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. News of the HOA's downfall spread quickly through the neighborhood, and the residents began to speak out, share their stories, and plan for the future. We formed a new neighborhood council, one that would be open, transparent, and truly representative of the people. The oppressive laws and regulations put in place by the HOA were removed, and homeowners were given the freedom to make decisions for their own property. But perhaps the most important thing that changed was the community itself. No longer would residents cower in fear of the HOA's reach. No longer would they be forced into submission by an organization that only cared about its own interests. They had seen what could happen when people came together, when they fought for what was rightfully theirs, and they were determined to make sure that the neighborhood stayed free. As I stood in front of my home that evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The fight wasn't over. There would always be new battles to face, new challenges to overcome. But I had proven something important, not just to myself, but to everyone who had ever been pushed around by an unfair system. I had shown them that it was possible to fight back, to reclaim control, and to rebuild what was broken. I turned to look at the street behind me, at the homes I had fought so hard to protect. This wasn't just my victory. It was ours, the people's victory. And as I walked inside, ready to begin the next chapter, I knew one thing for certain. We would never have to run from injustice again.